Welcome to Burn It All Down. Today I am joined by my wonderful co-hosts, Lindsay Gibbs and Amira Rose Davis. I'm Brenda Elsie. This past Saturday, January 24th, Alex Pretti was shot and killed by U.S. Border Patrol agents in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where he lived and worked as an ICU nurse. This occurred during widespread protests against ICE presence in Minneapolis, which also resulted in the killing of Renee Good in Minneapolis on January 7th. Good had been peacefully protesting the ICE actions, which have also occurred nationwide, and Good and Pretti sadly joined 32 other people who died by the hands of ICE or in ICE custody over the past year, at least. That's, ones that we know of. And given the secrecy in which ICE has operated, it's very unclear how many more are out there, how many are injured and wounded. Because sports are so important to us, because we swim in a world of them and athletes, I wanted to just check in about the state of sports and its relationship to these tragic murders at the hands of the state. Lindsay, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, sports exist in society, so they're a part of this, right? Like, you can't pretend that sports exist in this escapist void, even though we all use it for escapism at times. I mean, there's been the practical kind of thing, ways that sports has been impacted. The NBA postponed a game between the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Golden State Warriors, I believe it was, because it happened the day of Alex Pretti's murder. And the Target Center was very close to where the murder happened and where demonstrations were happening, and they believed it was safer to postpone that game. So, you have the logistics of sports are happening in this community, but you've also seen sports be a place that ICE has kind of targeted for sporting events for their enforcement. And then you just have the fact that athletes are humans and they're living in the same world that we are, and they are seeing the same images that we are. And a lot of them, not all it seems, are impacted by it in ways that we are. I think the tough thing is are they using their platform to speak out against it, or are they not? And, we're seeing a mixed bag. Women's sports, of course, are again kind of leading the way. Unrivaled is still the only sports league to issue a statement about this and kind of condemning what is happening in Minnesota. And Unrivaled co-founder Brenda Stewart on Sunday during player introductions held a sign that said "Abolish ICE," which I think is the strongest statement we've really seen from an athlete so far. It's not surprising to see women athletes, especially someone like Brenda Stewart, at the forefront of this, as we've covered on Burn It All Down, and of course as Amira has written about and studied and teaches about. Women athletes, especially Black or queer women athletes, Black and queer women athletes too, are often on the front lines of this. For Brenda Stewart, it's especially personal because her wife has a green card. She's from Spain and, is here on a green card. But I think I have a mixed bag because I don't think we're seeing the same sort of response we would have seen in 2020 or 2016. I think we're in a wave of athlete activism that has been more of the silent type lately. I think, and we can discuss this in women's sports, that's a lot because more money is coming in. And I think the more money you have at stake, it becomes a different calculus for speaking out. But so far I was very comforted is the very wrong word to use. But it was good to see Brenda Stewart holding that "Abolish ICE" sign. And there are a few other things that we can talk about that have given me some hope that athletes are finding their voice in this moment. But I'd love to know, kind of, Amira, what you've been thinking watching all of this.
Yeah, just a difficult time. And I think that we see things working very secular, like in cycles. And I've talked before about the history of athletic activism and how in many ways what we saw in like the 60s came out of what historians might refer to as the Emmett Till generation. People really shaped into political consciousness by a very high profile publicized killing of Emmett Till in 1955, and the way that bred a kind of generational consciousness moving into the 60s. And then thinking about like the last wave that we were probably more familiar with, the Trayvon generation. And so when we saw the wave in 2016, which is now somehow a decade ago, but certainly 5 years ago in 2020, when it really kind of boiled over, that felt like such a peak of athletic activism. And we were very used to statements and expressions and whatever. And I think that just in general, like not just athletes, but people in general have been so very fatigued in the last 2 years.
I felt it.
And I think you're just seeing that in general in terms of grassroots organizing. There's a lot of organizing. There's mutual aid happening. And the other thing that's been happening is there's been like a huge fight in terms of media. So a lot of people in Minnesota have been saying, like, you're not seeing the half of what's happening. I like to just shout out Minnesota in general as a blueprint for what it looks like to go out in negative degree weather, to stand shoulder to shoulder in defense of your neighbors and in defense of your community, in defense of fascism, right? Because like that's what we're at. And it feels really hard because I think in some ways it's required all of us. Like I think part of the fatigue comes from is like it's so bad that it feels overwhelming, and it feels like, okay, how do I do my day to day, right? And a lot of people I see have compared this to like, Germany 1937. Like, what does it look like when authoritarian rule comes in? And I just saw a video of somebody talking about like, be a upstander, not a bystander, and how many people were like actively opposed the Nazi party and how many people just were like, that's terrible, but like went upon their day. And while I think that there is historical precedent for thinking about this, like I also just think it's important to not act like this isn't very ingrained in American history. Nazi Germany came to Jim Crow America because we did racism so well that they were like, oh, like, let's figure out how you do legalize segregation. And so a lot of what we're talking about is really, really, really grounded in the American tradition, as well as the resistance that we're seeing. And what I mean by that is that I feel like we're at a cycle, like, and I'm wondering if this is actually a turning point, because I think that we're at this kind of moment in the cycle where you have to brush the fatigue off of you and say like, okay, like this is where we're at. The federal government is behaving in a way that is going to recede all of our rights, right? This is one of those situations where you're waiting till it affects you to get involved. It's already too late. And I think that when I say this might be a turning point I'm interested to see is because I think the same way that we saw in 2020, where at first it was a few people speaking out and then more demonstrations and it kind of like snowballed. And then it became a moment where people were like, oh, I am going to make a post. I am going to do this. I am going to get involved, and felt more freedom to do so, felt like more compelled to do so. And so I think even just in the last 24 hours, I've seen more like listicles of people being like, oh, here are athletes who are saying something. I just want to shout out people who might not get as much press, but Jordan Thompson, a love volleyball player, wore wristbands that said "Ice Out," and put that prominently displayed in her press conference. Kamara Williams, who's a gymnast for University of Georgia gymnastics team, made an Instagram post in which she talked about how disgusted she was feeling. She also rooted it in her Christianity to oppose this. Of course, my friend Sam Coffey also rooted her kind of opposition to this in her Christianity as well, and on Instagram, speaking out against this. And I do think it's interesting, Linz, to think about, I saw a discussion, for instance, about people who were like missing the old U.S. women's national
Yeah,
soccer
there was a
team.
post on Reddit about it. I don't know if this is what you saw.
Yeah.
But it came across my feed and being like, I don't care about this team anymore because they're not like speaking up for me.
Right. Exactly. And so that feeling of like, where's the Rapina? And so in that thread, they were saying like, who is speaking up. Of course, retired player Sam Ewis and Becky Sauerbrunn on their podcast took a moment to talk about this and address it directly. And then Sam reposted something. But the question was asked to Emma Hayes at training camp, like, has this come up internally? Has there been discussions? What's going on? And she talked about the fact that, like, they haven't had any team discussions. If anybody's having the conversation, she said it's not in front of her. She said, we haven't really had a lot of downtime in this training camp. We've certainly carved out time for mental health. We've been doing Legos as a team building thing. But she was like, and she said, it's not something I like to see. I'm sure that people would agree with, like, we don't want to see that. But she stopped short of saying that there was any kind of collective team moment reckoning. And I think a lot of people, it was just interesting to me, right? Like in that post, this kind of longing for this like team of the past that really kind of forged its identity around how politically active they needed to be, not only for just like general humanity purposes, but also for the, future of their league and pay equity and all of these concerns. I have seen the players associations of these organizations say stuff, right? And I think like you might see it there, like not on the league, but on the union side of things. And that doesn't necessarily surprise me, but I do think like that is something to like, that we're all keeping our eyes on. And the last thing that was interesting to me was Tara Davis, the long jumper, had made a post because somebody had said, this is why we need to boycott the Olympics. And she made a post and she was like, but that's not the point of the Olympics. It's the moment we can all come together and like actually think it's really important that we go. And it caused a lot of back and forth about this. And I just want to say that like that's also really historical. The debates in the 60s running up to both the 64 and the 68 games around particularly the question of if Black athletes should boycott the Olympic Games and not represent the country because of the state of the country was a huge debate. There were opposing op-eds taken out, for instance, between Mal Whitmore and Tommy Smith, one advocating to protest and boycott the games, one advocating to go, and both grounded in a belief that that action was like the best way to use the platform. And so I put the conversation that Tara was having, for instance, about that in the same bucket. I think that it's very easy on the sidelines to say, if I had that platform, this is what I would do. And I think that what we see in real time, especially with social media, is a lot of people figuring out, well, what do I do? Am I compelled to speak? How might I use this platform that I have? Is it reposting? Is it doing behind the scenes work that people don't know about? Is it charity donations? If you're from that community, we saw in 2020, because the world was also stopped, people like Gwen Berry could like go out into the streets, right? Like they were there too. And so I think that when I see this moment, I'm wondering if this, for not just athletes, but for everybody, is something more of a wake-up call, that sometimes we need that spark, right, to reignite a kind of grassroots protest movement that becomes mainstream, that becomes widespread.
I think we'll see. I mean, I think a few things just to that you brought up for me was, undoubtedly the U.S. women's national team is more conservative. Like, we know that there are a lot of conservative players in that team right now, and young players. And, there's reports that an abolish ICE sign was removed from the friendly over the weekend, and that the security guard said it was at the request of the team, which of course we don't know if that means U.S. Soccer Federation or, if it was somehow from the players itself, but, that's part of this narrative. And, we have a history of just kind of these more conservative players. Do want to shout out the Lynx, who are always kind of at the forefront of this stuff. The day before the Alex Pretti murder, you had there was a huge protest or kind of vigil in Minnesota already for Minneapolis, and Cheryl Reeve and members of the Lynx coaching organization and staff were there. Rebecca Brunson, who of course is a famous Lynx player, she's also one of the broadcasters for the Timberwolves, and she issued on air a really powerful statement in the pregame saying our community is not okay right now, watching an administration purge us of our neighbors, going into our stores and our schools and our hospitals, and really taking away people who make this community special. This is a very, very special community that we have here, and it's unfair. Thought it was very powerful that she addressed, I don't know if she said ICE specifically, but she addressed that it was the administration, and that it was targeting people instead of just we're thinking about those affected, we're thinking about those victims kind of generalization. And of course, Rebecca Brunson was part of the Lynx Core 4 that stood up in their Black Lives Matter shirts and kind of kicked off the wave of athlete activism we saw in the summer of 2016 around the murders of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling by police. So you're right. There is stuff happening, and I do wonder if this will wake up this slightly younger generation who is, maybe entered the sports world a little bit differently and with a little bit more on their platter than the trailblazers before them. But Brand, I'm also curious for you. This is taking it a little bit, wider of a scope, but we have a Men's World Cup coming up, and the international community is watching this. We had Sepp Blatter, Brenda's bestie, friend of the show.
You have a little kick around with him.
Yeah, call on, saying that fans should be worried about traveling to the World Cup. You also had a German soccer official, I believe, start to say, well, should we be talking about a boycott here? Like, the international community is watching.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Amira's point during the World Cup draw episode about the kind of ways in which authoritarianism forces you to make alliances with people and issues and groups you're not always comfortable with. That bridge stops here for me. That's, Sepp Blatter can fuck right off every day. That is a person that has just really no authority. And honestly, he wants to run again. You're not going to be able to believe it, but his suspension just ran out. And yeah, it's he and Michelle Plantini who were suspended for all types of financial improprieties, but it could have been other crimes, are now unsuspended. And so the reason you're seeing him speak out is because he can now run again. So anyway, we won't give him much of a platform here, but I do want to say in regard to the World Cup and connecting it with the U.S. women's national team, I am appalled and deeply hurt and disappointed by Cindy Parlow-Cone, who is someone that is now has been president of the U.S. Soccer Federation for years, who I admired for decades for her leadership in the U.S. women's national team because she's an exceptional player. But this is crushing. I mean, this immigration crackdown has been going on for over a year, and U.S. Soccer Federation is absolutely silent. They have said nothing while people and children at amateur games and events have been terrorized by ICE, while coaches have been left with no guidance about what to do when ICE approaches them. And you can't find them. You cannot find them. And it is so deeply disappointing. So I think the U.S. women's national team maybe feels, and I think they're right, that they have no support in that organization or leadership, much less in CONCACAF, dear God. I mean, you need to be saying that soccer is great because it's global and diasporic and interesting for all those reasons. And I will give a shout out to Seb Salazar for calling Alexi Lawless out, who said, oh, we hate to see what's happening in Minneapolis. And Seb Salazar commented, own your shit. This is what you knew what was going to happen when you supported the MAGA movement. So there's deep trouble within the soccer community where independent fans are bringing those signs. They are looking for some leadership and support there, and they're getting none. And MLS has issued, lifetime stadium bans if you try to bring any ICE sign in. So the leadership is totally at odds with the supporters who are, who are very progressive on this issue in general.
And I think it's like important to understand that like one of the things that we've seen in some of us were saying a few years ago is that the concessions that were given up by institutions and people in power towards demands for racial equity and protections for marginalized communities, for trans folks, all of these things, a lot of those concessions were so surface level, they didn't disrupt anything, which is like part of why, like, I know that some people 5 years ago were like, it's so important, like whoever thought that the NFL would even write end racism or that the NBA would, try to work with voting sites or like all these things. But as I've said a lot for the last few years, is like we're seeing why that lack of depth or kind of institutional reform mattered, because it was so easy to upend all of those steps forward. And now we've like slid back here. And I mean, that's history for you. It's not a linear march towards justice. And even when Martin Luther King Jr. is saying the arc of justice, like it's long, but it bends towards justice, but you have to bend it there. And I think that like one of the things that has happened is we're dealing with that creeping authoritarianism that has absolutely been meted out by institutional spaces. And this was very apparent in collegiate crackdowns on activism for Palestine, which eroded student rights, which I know at my university we've lost our faculty senate, so we have no shared governance. There's new restrictions on assemblage, on events, on speakers, on where students can speak, on what they can speak about what can be funded. They are actively trying to dismantle our departments, right? And so this is happening in newsrooms. This is happening, places. Washington Post, announced they were sending no reporters to the Olympics. They've this morning decided they're sending four, and so when we're talking about this and I'm saying, oh, part of this is a media issue, is because those institutions, universities, newsrooms, talk shows, all of these things have done the slide backwards. And so it's a new and harder position in which that we are operating from, versus thinking we're building off of 2020 or 2021, when in many ways we're at a much different starting point about what's been normalized. There are so many things that have been subtly normalized in terms of what people say, things that are so racist or so fashion, like just so incredibly, that 5 years ago would have been like, oh, you can't say that. And now it's celebrated. And so I think for people who are waiting, like, well, where is the line too far? I mean, this is why I say, is this moment a turning point? Because you saw that your government actively lying to you when there's a video. Jake Tapper on CNN, well, I'm not a fan of CNN, but put the official government spokes version of the event alongside the video, so you can see in real time when people say your government is lying to you, this is what it looks like. And I feel like that it was so undeniable that it became even a line too far. So you're seeing people kind of get thrown under the bus. Bovino has now lost his ranking, right? So like when you see little movements like that, and the Republican governor person in Minnesota has now suspended his run as a Republican because he was like, it can't be associated with that. So I think that it's an important time, both within the sports world and beyond it, to see if this is a catalyst for further opposition. Because while our hearts are with Minnesota, our minds should also be there, because they've been showing what happens when communities mobilize. And the last thing I want to say is, if you're listening to this and you're wondering, like, what can I do? How can I get involved? What can I do? I'll link in the show notes. There's a really handy thing that somebody had made of 6 different ways that you can get involved and oppose this. That includes making phone calls, sending emails to your elected representatives, donating to mutual aid networks. There's a range of things. And the idea is, if you can pick 3 to 4 things to do, to commit to, and everybody that you mobilize picks 3 to 4 things within that wheelhouse, then you start like really collectively making change. So we'll link those in the show notes if you're wondering how to get involved or what you can do, and choose something that feels comfortable for you. None of this, whether it's the athletes we're talking about or fans or whatever, is anything that I think you're never able to compel somebody to do something. You don't know their positionality. You don't know what safety feels like for them. You don't know their precarity. But I do think having something where you're like, all right, I can commit to doing 1, 2, 3 actions in my wheelhouse, right? And if we continue to do those things together, then I think we are doing the community work that is the only way that you oppose what we're facing.
Absolutely. Amen. Just want to mention, I think it's important to address how transphobia has been used to kind of split and divide these lines, and the same people who were kind of empowered by the transphobia in women's sports. I think it's the first time people noticed a lot of the conservatism in the new U.S. women's national team is with Corbin Albert and refusing to step up. And I just think the way that that has been used as a wedge issue is now being exploited in this it's being exploited in a way. I think it was Chris Bouchard, who's like a former, like, I don't know if he still does sports reporting or if he's just a troll on Twitter, but he was literally saying like, tweeted something really bizarre about like, well, yes, of course, the Alex Pretti thing looks bad, and yes, but what about the people on the left who think that men should play women's sports, and it's just like how
There's
it's
another
still
version of that where it was like, oh, the people who wanted to legalize same-sex marriage and this and that, all this stuff, now care about like norms and traditions. And it's like, oh, we think gay people should be treated humanely and equitably in the face of the law, and so you're like, yeah, so now I can execute people in the street. Like that's
it's just like but I just see these through lines, and I just wanted to call it out. Also, I don't think, there are rumors right now the Washington Post is shutting down its international and its sports coverage. And I do not think that it is a coincidence that those two are together. They see sports as part of the bigger world. It's another way to tell progressive stories through an international and domestic lens. I do not think they are shutting down the sports department because of their coverage of the Wizards or something, and so, don't let anyone ever tell you that sports aren't political. Obviously, if you're listening to this, you know that, but just something else to keep kind of through you. And then there's a couple of other little people I want to shout out. I know we're going to miss some of the big things, and apologize to anyone that I have missed here, but we had the Timberwolves, I believe, also, and the Minnesota Frost, the PWHL team in Minnesota, held a moment of silence for Pretti. And Shireen would be mad if I did not mention that, the Minnesota Frost game, before the puck drop, there was an entire league-wide chant of ice out. So I think you're also seeing ways that sports in these communities are providing a place for people to come together and find collective voice against the action. And, people are going to try and use sports to tear us apart, but there are powerful ways that not just through the athletes, but through the community of sports themselves, you can come together and speak out as part of a larger group and find power in that. And I hope that's a little bit of, I know for me, it's part of what I miss about Burn It All Down, is having this community to talk through these things with, to help me sort through my voice and think through things, and to just be with like-minded people. And I think it makes me a better person all around. And, not to make this about us, and not to be all, but I think part of the reason we're so excited about restarting this and hopefully being able to get started is to revive that community in a time when we really need it.
I think the same thing. And I just want to reiterate that all of us at Burn It All Down are thinking about Minneapolis, thinking about Pretti, thinking about Good, thinking about the 32 other people, And we appreciate you listening and, communing with us. And I'm so grateful to both of my co-hosts, Lindsay Gibbs and Amira Rose Davis, for joining me, because it's been a very hard time to process everything, and puncturing the spectacle, trying to pull the curtain back and talk about it with other people is helpful, and another part of building community. This is why we're trying to make more content here. The Kickstarter that we've put together is going to go live next week on February 2nd. And we really want to be an independent voice in this space that has so few independent voices, and to highlight all of these people doing this community work for everyone, and to hear from listeners and to engage with them. And so there is a Kickstarter. If you can subscribe to the YouTube channel and our newsletter, that would be incredible. But more than anything, I just love you both and appreciate you sharing your expertise and your thoughts with me today. So like we always say, burn on and not out.